Hello and welcome to what is a breaking news episode. And the reason why is nothing like starting the week on a Monday morning with a big bang, $1 trillion sell-off. You can already envisage the headlines at the end of today, Piers. But what's happened here is something's come out over the weekend and it has seen the likes of the NASDAQ 100 in the futures market. The cash is going to open while we are live recording this and we'll update you. But it's looking down about 5% with Nvidia down 12%. And I was looking, quick look at the technicals on the actual Nvidia chart and it's going to open below quite a key phase of consolidation it's been in really over the last 3 months. So it could get pretty interesting throughout Monday's trading session for sure. But more than that, want to understand what is going on. What is this new Chinese AI startup breakthrough? Why is it so important? We're also going to look at why perhaps a couple things that you might want to consider if you were just kind of getting somewhat blindsided by what's going on. But Piers, to bring us up to speed, I know you had an important client call this afternoon, which kind of goes and testifies to how big this market and unforeseen the reaction has been, because they had a lot of senior traders on that call and they had to cancel it to go back to the desk, right?
Well, I had a Morgan Stanley meeting, with some sort of various kind of trading managing directors from various parts of the trading division. They've all postponed. They're like, we cannot leave the desk. It is absolutely kicked off, to say the least. And actually, and look, there obviously there's a lot of trade volume going through. We'll talk about why in a sec. But as of this morning, and this was like, this is a few hours ago now, about 200,000 NASDAQ 100 futures contracts had traded, which was actually 4 times more than the 30-day average. And that was like 1 hour after the sort of open of that futures contract. So yeah, it's a classic scenario of, people rolling out of bed and going, what, hang on, what? Are those numbers actually true? And I think it's almost like, you can't say this wasn't sort of on the risk radar. And it's always just one of those things that, okay, it's a risk, could happen, got no idea really when. When is now? And so DeepSeek is the new name in town. And this is a Chinese mainland kind of startup. And I mean, this has been kind of rolling through sort of, I'd say the second half of last week. So they released a detailed paper. This is DeepSeek now, right? They released a detailed paper last week explaining how they, basically an instruction manual to build a large language model that could then automatically learn and improve itself. All right. Remember that these large language models, let's say like Meta's Llama, for example, these large language models are key for training AI tools like ChatGPT, for example. And of course, up until this point, there's been a massive moat and a barrier to compete because of the cost of compute power. Nvidia, the poster child of the AI revolution, has an almost, I'm not even sure what the percentage market share is, but it's almost the entire market share for producing these super chips that are these GPUs that are the only ones we thought that are powerful enough to kind of deal with all of this large language model training situation. And so, and the US have been quite keen to protect their lead in this, what is a technology arms race. We'll come back to that point in a minute, because some people are kind of beginning to start to compare this to another arms race that happened a few decades ago and kind of kicked off the space race. But we'll come on to that in a second. But yeah, basically, Nvidia, we had thought, had been well ahead of the game producing these chips. The Biden administration had prevented these chips from being exported to China, the idea being to hold China back so they can't compete on the same level. Well, this news really throws all of that out of the window. And actually, maybe they can compete with inferior chips, but also, as a result, on a budget that is a tiny fraction of what these big gun, Mag 7 companies have been spending. And so, in short, this has thrown a spanner in the whole works of this AI revolution to date, where it's the rich and those big Mag 7 companies that have got the cash to afford these Nvidia chips, it was thought that it was an exclusive race. Not anymore. It was just our episode last week. We were talking about how, this kind of joint venture between OpenAI and SoftBank was like bringing together some entities to be able to provide the capital and firepower to get up onto the level to compete with, the Metas and the Googles and the Microsofts. And actually this news here is, well, actually forget all of that. You can do it at a fraction of the cost.
So just looking, Nvidia's just opened. It opened down, I think, about 13%, and it's just bounced back to down just 10.5 now. But early days, yeah. But just explain to me then, because Microsoft are down 4.4, Google's down 3.5, so all the big names, big tech.
Yeah.
But just talk to me about the kind of context here, in terms of the implications on cost in particular.
So the market reaction. All right, there's several different pockets of the market that are getting hammered here for slightly different reasons. So you've got the Nvidias. Firstly, you've got your chip producers, you've got any companies that are supplying, part of that AI supply chain. So Nvidia, ARM, for example, they're your chip suppliers, ASML, they're getting hammered. And that's because, maybe you don't need their super advanced chips that are crazy expensive to get involved with this game, right? It was thought they had dominant market share. Maybe that market share is now going to get eroded. So that's kind of number one. Then you go back a step, one more step through the supply chain. There's companies like Siemens Energy, Schneider Electric. They supply hardware for AI infrastructure, right? Siemens Energy, German company, down 22% today. Schneider's Electric, that's a French company, they're down 9.2, right? They're kind of electrical power products, okay, which are used in these big data centers, okay? So you've got those types of companies. So they're directly involved with this AI software infrastructure side. Then take another angle. Well, all of these big Mag 7 companies, Meta, Microsoft, and actually Meta, just on Friday, which was kind of after this kind of DeepSeek stuff started to move, Zuckerberg on Friday actually reconfirmed that Meta planned to spend $65 billion in 2025 on AI infrastructure. Microsoft last week, they said they're going to spend $80 billion in 2025 on infrastructure. You just had that OpenAI SoftBank tie up. They're going to spend $500 billion in the next 5 years, right? Now, up until this point, there's been a thesis that you have to spend big to be in this race. And is there going to be a return on investment for, are these companies that are spending big, are they the ones that are going to win the big pie that will be the revenue that comes out of all this AI world of the future, right? Well, all of this big news is basically potentially saying, well, you've wasted all that money. You shouldn't have spent it, or you can do it at a fraction of the cost. Okay, so that argument about they're going to see big return on investment from these massive investments, that argument's been massively dented here. So you're getting the big companies, as you were mentioning there. So I'll just go through them. Microsoft has just opened down 4.2%. You got Meta down 2.5%. Google are down, all right. Not as much as Nvidia, who are directly in the firing line, as in potential direct revenue hit here. The second order effect is that lack of return on investment. And so Amazon are down 3% here, Tesla down 2%, and so on, right? Then you've got, what does this mean for the big indices? Because obviously all these companies I've just mentioned, they're the big dominant forces in the indexes. So now you go and look at the NASDAQ, which has just opened. It's just opened down 3%, okay? And actually, it has bounced here a little bit already, as you were mentioning. So some of these, this is so live as we're talking. It was, I think we opened down about 5% on the NASDAQ. It's now down 3%. But of course, because these massive Mag 7 companies make up such a huge part of the index, then, of course, they're getting hammered as well.
There's one Mag 7, your defensive Death Star, is actually up nearly 2%. So the fact that Apple is so far behind in the AI race is actually come as their savior today.
that you're absolutely right. Apple is up 1.6% here because they haven't spent anything yet, or nowhere near the amount the others have. And it's almost like, well, hang on, that's genius. Now they've held back. Well, now they can enter the race at a much cheaper price. Other market reactions, the VIX, which is looking at as kind of a volatility index, the fear gauge, we called it earlier on this morning, that was spiked up 45%. Let me see. I'll try and get a reading on the current price. It's now up 33%. So yeah, you're definitely getting some big kind of reversals. But these markets are all still quite heavily down, although the amount they're down is reducing as the more we go through this podcast, actually.
Yeah, and interestingly, this is earnings season. So we do, in fact, have the likes of Microsoft, Apple, all coming out this week with their profit growth already under a bit of pressure. So interesting that they're obviously going to be asked in the analyst calls about this, and this has kind of shifted the entire focus on
you might remember a couple of years back, even before, like 3 years back, before the AI thing kicked off, Meta were talking about investing in the metaverse, right? And actually, as Zuckerberg came onto these earnings calls and said, we are going to spend X billions, X being a large number, on this metaverse thing, it was almost like the more they were committing to spend, the worse it was. And their share price would get hammered. I think you might actually now get a beginning of that trend here for AI. So the more, like if Microsoft on their earnings call later this week come out and said, yeah, we're still committed to $80 billion spend this year, I think you're going to see that feed through negatively in their share price. And analysts on the call are going to be asking, well, why? Now, why are you spending that amount of money? Surely this is a waste of cash flow and so on. So it'll be these earnings calls. I mean, the CFO, I do not envy the CFOs and the CEOs on those earnings calls later this week having to try and navigate through this kind of very obviously live development.
Yeah, everyone's becoming an AI expert once again. I'm sure the thought leadership on LinkedIn is going to be lit up later on today. But
it's going to be interesting what Trump says. I mean, look, it's only 9:30 a.m. over in the east coast of the US. What's Trump's response? Obviously, last week, Trump was like, obviously slapping everyone on the back from OpenAI and SoftBank, coming to the Oval Office. Aren't you amazing? We're going to spend $500 billion. We're going to create so many jobs. So the geopolitical angle here, given that how the US had imposed those stringent restrictions on chip exports to China, thinking that they were hindering their ability to compete. I mean, well, what do they say now?
This is what happens when the president makes decisions without his co-president. If you leave Elon out in the cold, you have to pay a penalty, I'm afraid. But look, I just thought, having worked in news aggregation, let's call it, in my career, for the 20 years, there's definitely, I think, behavioral elements to this, i.e. the interpretation, as you would have seen many times, where it's that knee-jerk reaction. As you said at the top of the show, you wake up and you see the market's down that heavy, they start selling, momentum selling, and it all starts to trigger off. There's a couple of things I was just thinking, right, let's just step back and let's just ask a couple questions here about more legitimately whether this is as a serious kind of existential threat is kind of how the press are pinning it, and this is their job to talk it up. So a couple things I'd just like to flag. One is the potential strategic messaging behind this. So, i.e. a counter to the US leadership narrative of what we just had last week. So DeepSeek's announcement, I think it's not without surprise. It comes just literal 1 week after this first week in office, this real kind of signposting of make America an AI leader and this investment project. And a couple of things on that. One, it's Chinese New Year this week as well. So I think that timing is compounded, particularly because there was economic data that came out that again shows the Chinese economy is faltering. Industrial activity is weakening. There's still big question marks on many different pockets of the Chinese economy. And people in China are about to go and see their friends and loved ones all across the country and have a week of down tools. And so that in combination with the Stargate announcement, there's nothing like a little bolstering of national pride. And we see this with what we have with the quality of information. So people always say, you should always question the quality of Chinese economic statistics that you see. Why? Because there's such deep state kind of involvement in a lot of these things. And DeepSeek self-censors on topics. So actually, if I was reading this thing and it was saying, if you were to basically do a query on Tiananmen Square protests or geopolitical events, it won't answer your questions. So actually then, yes, it's open source and all these different things, but it's being content curated in terms of what information is actually driving these models. The DeepSeek bot is capable of giving detailed responses about political figures, of course, in India, but it won't say anything about Xi. So that's one thing. The next then is who's actually vetted this claim? I mean, it seems quite clear. The case is very compelling, and it's absolutely the perfect kind of antidote, if you like, for a Chinese response. But so far, there is no public third-party confirmation of what DeepSeek are saying. Zero. And DeepSeek publication of the paper outlining their R1 model, while I think you can argue some transparency of putting that out does lend some credibility, one of the things I'd be looking out for is independently verified experts who start running this model to see about its performance and efficiency claims. Because it's not like the Chinese don't overstate these things in the past.
But to counter your point, their app is right now available in the App Store. And actually, one of the things that's kind of triggered some of this reaction is it went to #1 in the App Store over the weekend. And so it's there. You can use their product. And actually, people that are using it are saying, actually, wow, yeah, this is all right. It's not as quick and as good as the latest, Chat GPT version. But it's like, well, hang on. How have they built this when they have not had access to H100 chips from Nvidia because they've been blocked because of sanctions? So it's like, well, how has it been possible for them to have done this? And sure, I mean, I don't know. I saw one number saying they managed to train it with a budget of $5 million. I don't know where that $5 million came from, rather than the multiple billions. I think actually US big tech spent $250 billion last year on infrastructure, right? So 5 million, God knows where that number came from. But it's like, well, how have they done? They've done it. Now, how have they done it? Well, fine. They're spinning the story that they've done it on their own super cheap. Now, that hasn't been verified. I don't know how they've actually done it. But for now, the product is there. It's available. They can download it, have a go. And the experience is very good.
Yeah, until Trump will come out and announce in the next 48 hours that app is no longer going to be downloadable in certain geographic territories, I'm sure. But a couple of things then. So one, is this just a natural cycle? You said earlier, Nvidia was so dominant in this space that not that they're getting complacent, but you need an event like this in order to just sharpen the mind again from the US big tech scene to just actually, this is a good wake-up call, talking not, today, Monday's trading session, but over the more medium term, now that they're aware of this and the possibility of this, then that's a good thing.
Yep. I mean, so there are counter-arguments. Well, firstly, hang on, before the counter-argument, it shouldn't be a surprise. I think it should be a surprise if the cost of all of this remains crazy, ridiculously high. Prices set by Nvidia because they've essentially cornered the market. There's this law, it's called Moore's Law. Basically, Microsoft wouldn't exist as a business if Moore's Law wasn't true. So Moore's Law is this law, dates back to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, where basically every 2 years, the cost of infrastructure for all things like using semiconductors and all the rest of it, anything computing, basically the cost of it all halves every 2 years. This is Moore's law. And Microsoft in the 80s took advantage of computers going from being this massive, crazy, expensive things that take up a whole room to being on everybody's desk, across the workforces of the Western world, right? That was only possible because the cost of it all dropped. This is now, why would you expect Moore's law to not apply in this new AI age? And I think some investors have been expecting it for some reason. They don't think it's going to apply. Well, here it is. And I don't think that should be surprising. That's one thing to say. But there are counter arguments, right? And look, you've got to be careful here because there's a lot of people talking their own book. If you're still long Nvidia, you're out note to clients this morning going, this is nonsense. You shouldn't believe it. You shouldn't believe these Chinese, unverified, breaking news and what have you. One argument that's kind of coming to the surface of all of that, which might have some credibility, I would say, is that apparently DeepSeek were able to kind of take shortcuts in its own training costs by leveraging the latest models from OpenAI, right? Meaning, okay, they might have caught up. They're not in line with OpenAI, and they're certainly not in front of them. They're behind, right? But they're a lot closer behind than we had thought. But if they're reliant on whatever latest model OpenAI has available out to the world, well, of course, they're always going to be behind. Because OpenAI, well, they're working on their next version right now, right? It's not available to anybody other than themselves. So if they're reliant on OpenAI's models, they'll always be 12 months behind. And so that's, I think, actually a pretty good argument to say that whilst this is, wow, shock, big news, it might not mean, it's not the death knell for Nvidia's sort of, 90% of their revenue.
And ultimately, if this was a completely Chinese-run shop and not using that OpenAI system, for example, surely the adoption of this AI would be impeded by a business's willingness to use that technology if it's Chinese-owned. And
right.
So isn't it then better that this happens so big tech in the US can basically understand the kinks in their armor and understand the adoption techniques to drop costs, perhaps? Because there's no way that a Western developed world is going to buy Chinese and implement its technology within its business on a large scale, surely.
No, but I think the point is that if you're Microsoft sat there, right, you've budgeted out for 2025 and the biggest line item on your whole budget is 80 billion spend on AI infrastructure. If I was Microsoft, I'd now be going, okay, hang on a sec. Let's just revisit that line item. And how is it that this Chinese company has managed to do what they've done on a shoestring budget? Actually, maybe we don't need to be spending disgusting amounts of billions. And maybe we can do this, as in Microsoft, maybe we can do this much more efficiently. So I think it actually could be, in the medium term, could be good for the big tech, as they actually end up spending a lot less than they would have done. In the short term, it's bad because they've already spent a ridiculous amount and it might be that it's wasted money. But then Nvidia are right in the firing line because, right, how much market share will they now lose if their chips are being sold at a crazy price and people don't need to buy them anymore? So I think this is going to be a messy few days, and those earnings calls are going to be really key. Nvidia right now is down 11%. Is Nvidia going to rebound to unchanged and recover all of these losses? In my opinion, no. I actually think for Nvidia, this is kind of end of chapter 1 where they've just had the whole market to themselves and they could price whatever they want. I think it's literally end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 then, I'm not saying they're now, that's it, but it's just it's going to be a step change and just an interesting turn of the page.
Yeah, and interestingly as well, to close, there was that Consumer Electronics show that we just had, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
And Nvidia were talking very much around robotics, autonomous vehicles. Mm-hmm. So are they looking to spread their wings as well into different
Yeah,
parts of that
that's
AI
timely.
cycle.
Well, that's it, and that's what you should do. If you got in the good times, don't just sit back in your armchair on the beach and think, "Wow, aren't I amazing?" You got to start planning ahead, right? How are we going to diversify? Because they're obviously hugely reliant on one type of revenue. So it's about, right, let's diversify this thing out and make sure we're locked in, across the different kind of stages of this sort of AI journey.
Okay, great. Well, look, great to get your thoughts. I know it's fresh off the press, so I'm sure there's going to be lots of developments throughout the week. But yeah, good to get your take, and I hope everyone found that useful. Thanks, Piers.
Thanks a lot.